There they go. Now we're on. Sorry, everyone at home and here. Welcome to the July 11th. Boy, that seems really loud tonight. 2019 Muscatine In-Depth City Council. Cindy, will you please do the roll call?
Councilmember Spread,
Present.
Harvey,
Present.
Brockert,
Present.
Saucedo,
Present.
Brackett,
Present.
Fitzgerald,
Here.
Malcolm,
Present.
7 present, 0 absent, Your Honor.
Thank you. Well, this is an in-depth meeting, so we are going to dive right on in. We have two presentations tonight. The first one is from Barker Lamar. Tim?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to give you a quick, maybe not so quick, update on your consent order and your status of your groundwater out at the landfill. So what I'm going to go through is give a little background overview of the consent order, summary and the status of where you're at, and then talk about what has been done at the landfill since I last presented in 2017. Talk about the groundwater impact, what's next, and then quickly touch on the C&D landfill. So back in February of 2015, you entered into a consent order with the DNR regarding some issues that you were having at the landfill. We got an amendment to that consent order which extended the time frame for the assessment of corrective measures from December 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2019. It also moved out the time frame for bracketing the contaminant plumes. The reason for that was DNR for quite a few years, and this isn't specific to your site, had been questioning the validity of the representativeness of the groundwater samples from the typical sampling methodology that was used, which was essentially sampling with a baler. That tended to stir up a lot of sediment in the wells. The samples could be a little bit more muddy. They had higher metals concentrations then, and consequently, is that really what was in the water, or was it what was in the sediment? So we switched you over to low flow sampling, which got the sediment out of the water, changed your metals concentrations, then we were required to update the background based on the new data. So we needed a window of time to collect new data and then update your background. And the reason that's significant for your assessment of corrective measures is all your contaminant plumes have to be bracketed to background. So with all of the old data getting thrown out, new data being collected, essentially the background became a moving target. And it was going, and it did go down, the concentrations, getting the sediment out, concentrations were lower. Consequently, at one point when we were bracketed, we suddenly weren't bracketed. So that's kind of what that 2-year extension was to address. Interestingly, the consent order is almost exclusively associated with groundwater, despite all of how it read. Groundwater was the thing to make everything compliant. And it ends with you selecting a remedy. So we're approaching the assessment of corrective measures stage, which you'll have a proposal in front of you next week for that effort. And then I'll go through what happens after that later in this presentation. This is a little Gantt chart of your consent order and the items. What I have in green is basically what's completed. And there's still some question on the plume bracketing. I'll get some clarification from the DNR. And the last item in gray there in the corner, I know it's hard to read, but that's the assessment of corrective measures due at the end of this year. The last two items can't really put on a schedule because they're dependent upon when DNR approves the assessment of corrective measures. Okay, so in the last couple of years, we have installed 14 groundwater monitoring wells, either to bracket the plumes or to get additional background. One of your background wells was contaminated, not associated with the landfill. We don't know why, and DNR wasn't interested, and they approved abandonment of that well. That left you with essentially one background well, and it was super clean. So essentially background then would have been very, very low concentrations. What we did, also you've got wells that are screened in limestone bedrock and wells that are screened in clay. Your background well was only screened in clay. You didn't have a background well for the limestone. So we installed a background well for the limestone and also a background well on the other side of the site to try to get some different metals concentrations for your background, and that seems to have paid off. We did get some higher concentrations in that background than what was in your existing well. We've updated the background here just recently, so we have a better picture of what we have to bracket to, and in most cases I think we are bracketed. And then we've continued doing the routine groundwater sampling and evaluation and tried to better position the site for this assessment of corrective measures, and you'll see some of the effects of that as we touch on the areas of contamination. Groundwater impact I've divided into 3 areas, the east side, the south side, and the southwest side, and we'll talk about those individually. Quick overview of the landfill. North is to your left. So the east side is at the top. That's where you have contamination, a little bit of contamination off-site. Probably where the worst of the impact is. And then the south side, it's kind of in that little area where the pink line bumps in. And then the southwest side is down by the lagoon. It's where you see more of the little white text is well labels. You see a little kind of a light brown spot down there. That's where your loadout is for your leachate tank, and the lagoon is down there. So that's the third area, the southwest area. So the east side, it's 4 wells that are in corrective action. So that means there's 4 wells that have contamination above a groundwater protection standard, and it requires you to address that. The constituents of concern, arsenic, barium, and cobalt. Due to the sampling that we've done and some reevaluation that we can do, like I said, we've gotten some lower metals concentrations. That's not only in your background. In some cases, that's in your compliance wells also. So I think a couple of the SSLs that you had before, SSL, let me say what that stands for, exceeding a groundwater protection standard at a statistically significant level. And I'll just say SSL from here on out. So in a couple of wells, the concentrations drop sufficiently that it will be able to request vacating those SSLs, and those will no longer need addressing. Generally delineated as far as the plumes, you have to delineate them both vertically and horizontally. We're not exactly at background vertically at 39, and there could be an argument. We may need a well down gradient of MW4. There's an argument that we wouldn't, so I'll kind of get some clarification with DNR. And there's also a potential benefit depending upon what we can get as far as your remedy is concerned, that having a well down gradient of 4 might be beneficial, and I'll explain that in a bit. Groundwater contamination in this area is due to leachate migration. And what we are targeting as a remedy for this area would be some regrading of Ravine 5. The area has settled, doesn't drain well, so you tend to get some minor ponding on the surface of the landfill, which is just going to soak in, create more leachate, and that pushes out. And that's what you're seeing in your wells. And this next slide is just it's a geochemical depiction of both leachate and one of the groundwater wells. The fact that they match so closely is a clear indication that the contamination in the groundwater on that side of the site is from leachate. So if we can lessen the leachate generation, we'll lessen the migration, and hopefully nature will then take care of itself. And going back to this, so source control regrading of Ravine 5, that would be your least costly option. And then this AZPOC is an attenuation zone point of compliance. That's a new concept that at least part of this DNR has come up with since we last talked. And essentially what it means, or what it is, your point of compliance from your waste boundary is 50 feet. The DNR, and I agree, doesn't believe that 50 feet is a long enough distance for nature or natural attenuation to address contamination. So if bacteria and dilution and things like that were going to happen, it needs more distance than 50 feet. So this attenuation zone point of compliance will allow up to, I believe it's 392 feet, I think it is, away from the waste boundary for a point of compliance. And then that becomes the monitoring point for remedial compliance. So you get a lot bigger space. If we can apply that to the east side, it definitely lessens what you would have to do. Otherwise, we were previously looking at potentially some sort of active leachate extraction from that area to try to prevent the leachate from migrating off-site. So we'll be shooting for that remedy in the assessment of corrective measures for that east area. On the south side, it's one well in corrective action, and that's MW23. Constituent of concern is benzene. Contamination is delineated at this point. Concentrations fluctuate, so for one well, we're kind of right on the border. It looks like it's gas migration in this case, not leachate. And interestingly, in Ravine 4, which is the closest waste area to this south side impact, at some point in the past, you had installed a whole bunch of gas vents. So gas as a concern must have been identified quite some time ago. It's the only ravine with gas vents in it, but you've already put in some source control. If we did have to come down here and drill another monitoring well, it may make sense to put a vent or two right between that well and the waste and see if we can't vent the gas out and clean up the groundwater that way. But at this point, the groundwater's not getting better, it's not getting worse, it's bracketed. I think we would just be looking at monitoring. Southwest side, 2 wells in corrective action, 11 and 13. Those are a well nest, which means they're right next to each other. One is shallow, one is deep. One is in the clay, one's in the bedrock. Constituent of concerns, vinyl chloride. Cobalt SSLs on this side of the site look like they'll be able to be vacated. Same reason I talked about before with the new sampling methodology, lower concentrations. Looks like we're essentially meeting the criteria at this point. So we'll blame those on sediment, not on contamination, and ask that they be vacated. Impact is delineated. The source of this impact appears to be overfills of the tank, historical overfills, nothing current. And the reason I say that is when we first started working on the site, monitoring well 11, which is the which is the shallow well, was the dirtiest. It's cleaned up pretty well. 13 is still contaminated, and it's kind of steady. It's not getting any worse. So if it was a tank overfill, and I did talk to Dan Ganser a couple years ago, and he did indicate that way back, I think when some of your first subtitle D cells, when they were first opened, the amount of liquid that you got hit with sometimes after a rain before the cell had been covered, that it may have overwhelmed your system. You have a lagoon over there now, so that's being addressed as far as your capacity, and you've been managing it very well for sure since we've been involved, so there's no indication of any overfills occurring, and the groundwater is cleaning up. Again here, I think natural attenuation will be the remedy, and hopefully what that would mean is just monitoring, no active cleanup. If you have any questions anytime, please just stop me. Okay, so next steps, I'll clarify the plume bracketing status with the DNR and we'll proceed as necessary. Then we would prepare the assessment of corrective measures report. That's due December 31st of this year. You do have some money in your budget to look at regrading of Ravine 5. I think that'd be a good idea. You're not going to gain any ground really if you have all of that liquid continuing to soak in and migrate out. And then following DNR approval of the assessment of corrective measures, you'll have to hold a public meeting. Typically that would be one of these meetings. We would have to invite the DNR and any interested or affected parties. Anyone can be interested. Affected is pretty much anyone around the landfill. So we would discuss your impact, what you intend to do about it. Then we have to take any comments into consideration before selecting a remedy within, I think it's 60 days of the public meeting. Then we select a remedy. That'll have a schedule then for implementation. Again, what we're shooting for, if we can justify it, and we've been collecting a lot of data to do so, will be that largely you're just monitoring. So there won't be a big remedy implementation, particularly if you've already done something with the Ravine 5 grading issue. And then once you've selected a remedy, you have 30 days to establish corrective action financial assurance. You're probably familiar or may be familiar with closure and post-closure financial assurance. This is the third leg. If you have to do a corrective action, then it requires financial assurance. And it requires financial assurance for the entire amount that it takes to get to everything cleaned up to the code requirement. So if that's projected to be 50 years, you've got 50 years of costs. Now the interesting difference with this financial assurance versus closure post-closure, no cash set aside is required, just a financial assurance mechanism. Closure post-closure, you're always putting money away until that's fully funded. That's not the case with this. And again, if we can get a monitoring only remedy, that will keep this projection of cost down significantly. And then you'll implement that remedy, which probably will be a corrective action groundwater monitoring plan, and hopefully nothing else. Of course, we could, if need be, we can step up to active leachate extraction for that east side, but that's not what we're going to lead in with. Okay, now the C&D landfill. This just gives you, if you're not familiar with its location, it's right by the cemetery. The tiny building on the very south side or bottom of this picture, actually that's the west side. Once again, north is to your left. That's the transfer station, if you know where that is. So the yellow dot with the red arrow, that's where the C&D landfill is. We've been pushing to try to end post-closure at that site. It seems to be quite a benign site. In my opinion, we should end it and not have to monitor. So we're trying to get to that point. So a couple years ago, and DNR actually required this in a letter. It's typical of what they have been doing with old sites, is move you to what's called Appendix 1 sampling. So previously, your permit required you to do what was called E&F list sampling, which is about 7 or 8 parameters that were strictly indicator. They didn't really tell you anything from does this site pose a threat to human health or the environment? They just indicated if there was a problem. So they've been moving those sites to Appendix 1, which is the type of sampling you do out at the active landfill. Then we're changing the statistics because the statistics they're not really valid. I won't go into why. And then trend testing. So if the contamination is not getting if there's impact and it's not getting worse, it's steady or declining, that would be significant for getting acceptance of ending post-closure. We've been pressing the topic with the DNR to try to, get it on their radar, get this, get us moving down the road to end post-closure. And as we've done inspections, if we see things that the DNR would maybe be a red flag to the department, we've pointed those out more more profoundly, and staff have really gotten right on and gotten the stuff taken care of, which basically has been some really old pieces of metal, maybe an old crushed piece of culvert or something that was part of the waste that you don't want on the surface. That's essentially been it, but basically like to have DNR come out and not have any issues. 2 times now, although it's 2 different people at the department, so I'm not sure that they've communicated, have indicated some sorting out of the waste boundary may be required. The first time that came up, I said, that's not really possible, because the way that landfill worked, it was a C&D landfill for a relatively brief period of time, and then you stopped taking C&D, but were permitted to take clean rubble. And so the waste was then covered with clean rubble. So how you would ever find a waste boundary under that would be quite a task, and I'm not sure it's worth it. So we'll keep pushing back on that. And then typically what happens in ending post-closure, when you're close, then someone from the main office, DNR will come down and walk the site. So with this fall sample, which we've just recently done, we will have a big enough data set to run the trend tests. We'll run those. If the trends are steady or declining, if everything is cleaned up, you have 1 high arsenic and 1 high cobalt, but I'm not sure that that'll be a showstopper. And then we'll try to push forward and hopefully be able to bring this to an end, and this will be off your list of things to do. If you have any questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
What does C&D stand for?
Oh, sorry. Construction and demolition.
Okay, thank you.
Santos?
You mentioned 14 monitoring wells. What's the depth of those?
I believe they were anywhere from 100 or so feet to as shallow as probably 15. It depended on a couple of things. One, if it was a water table well, it depended upon how deep it was to water. So wells on the south side, in an area that used to be Barrow, the groundwater is pretty shallow. So those are very shallow. On the southwest side, the contamination there is quite deep. That's another reason why I think that the contamination in that area is from overfills of the tank, because you got a nice clay layer before you get down to bedrock, and under the landfill, so the landfill is kind of up on a hill, and you've got even thicker clay under the landfill, and the first bedrock under the landfill is I believe it was a shale, or in some areas a dolo stone, possibly in another. So it's not a permeable bedrock. When you get out to the fringes, and particularly the west side, the uppermost bedrock is limestone. So that's a more permeable bedrock. How did the contamination get from the landfill down into the bedrock? Because the contamination that was initially found there, right by the ditch, was 55 feet down. It was drilled through, the well was drilled through clay, through limestone, through a layer of shale, into another layer of limestone. That's where it was screened, and that's where the contamination was found. We did put in a shallow well to see if possibly contamination moved shallow, and the bedrock well wasn't constructed properly, and maybe contamination went down the annulus of the borehole. That wasn't the case. The shallow well was clean. The tank is installed quite deep. About the bottom of it's about 22 feet down. The top of the bedrock at that location, there happens to be wells right next to the tank, 11 and 13, in fact, the wells that are the problem. The bedrock's about 23 feet down. So I think that tank is basically sitting on top of the limestone. So probably you had an overfill or a few overfills, went down, ran around the tank, got in the limestone, migrated off to the west. So, really long answer to your question. To bracket that plume, we went off-site to the west. The ground, we wanted to get far enough off so that we would have a clean well, because we didn't want to keep chasing a plume. The ground surface goes up fairly steeply when you get on the other side of the road. So we're higher in elevation, but we had to get down to a fairly deep bedrock to be at the same level to make sure that we were intersecting the flow path. So that was the well that was 100 plus feet deep.
So when we dug the new wells that we dug for, you did ones for sampling, did we go through current pipe, or did we dig a complete new well for that to be able to get that slower flow to get the different sampling?
We utilized all your existing wells for the low flow.
Okay. So
Essentially what we did was, depending upon the depth of water, so if the depth of water is less than about 25 feet.
And when you say that, is that groundwater, or is that basically well water, like aquifers type depths?
Depth to,
Because if
it's-
you're
it's
going
a-
to, if you're going to 100 and some feet, you're basically going to aquifer depths.
in the case of, I don't know if that limestone is necessarily an aquifer or a usable aquifer. We're going to,
Well, you're
going
hitting
to ground.
bedrock, is what you said.
Right. Some limestones are, fractured, but they don't have a lot of water, and they don't
Okay.
necessarily produce a lot of water. So they may not be considered an aquifer. We went to groundwater in all cases. Most of the time, we would be going to the water table, except for in the case of the bracketing of the vinyl chloride plume on the southwest side, we had to get down to the level where the contamination was. And as far as then the low flow, we used all your existing wells, and if the depth to water in the well is less than 25 feet down, you can use what's called a peristaltic pump. So the only thing you have to install is a piece of tubing. Pull a vacuum on it, and it'll come up. You get deeper than that, the vacuum, you're using the weight of the air to push the water up. Deeper than 25 feet, it's not going to push it up.
Okay.
Then you have to put in a submersible pump. The wells we installed were, the majority were for bracketing. So we have contamination here, and we don't know how far it goes. So we put in a well. Hopefully
Test.
this is clean, and then we're bracketed.
Okay.
Two of the wells we put in were for getting more background data. One for the limestone, and one, your background well that was existing was close to a half a mile away from a lot of your contamination. So we put one on the other side, kind of spanned your contamination and got representative background from both sides.
So in your remediation requests or discussions that you're going to bring to us is natural attenuation is what you're basically thinking is our remediation? No carbon filters, no way of cleaning anything back up through there? I mean, how do we know if the plume isn't going to move?
Well, you have to monitor it. What part of the corrective action is a groundwater monitoring plan. So you'll have to monitor that plume until it reaches.
Or we'll hire you to do that? Or,
Or whoever you have doing the.
Yeah.
Right. It's definitely your I would say, your least cost solution. You have I think next month there'll be we'll have another proposal for you. It's for a SCADA system for your leachate. So what happens, this will have a number of different benefits, but the primary one is that the leachate runs into your 2 tanks, and then it has to be pumped out before the tanks overflow. This will automate pumping of the leachate between tanks and from the tank to the lagoon. So a person won't have to go and run that. So you have a lot more time to react and to wait until you have to be getting rid of leachate. From a remedial perspective, the benefit of that will be if we can convince the DNR to approve this attenuation zone point of compliance, that's only done with source control, and source control that's more heavily monitored. So your source control that we're proposing is improving that cap. And that'll be our first shot at solving the problem. The next step, which is what had been contemplated before, was basically going out there and putting leachate extraction wells in. Okay, so imagine if we did that, and I'm not saying that we won't end up there, but trying not to. If you're collecting leachate, then that has to be hauled and disposed. So when you go then to calculate your corrective action financial assurance, then not only is it the cost of the monitoring and the cap maintenance and those things, it's going to be that volume of leachate transportation and disposal times a lot of years. That'll really make that number get big. If we can have this be monitoring on a kind of reduced schedule, I don't think we would necessarily have to watch these plumes twice a year. That'll be a lot smaller number. The other thing that I'm interested in, it's not necessarily critical for you, but in your post-closure financial assurance, there's leachate disposal costs, an estimate of what it costs to dispose of leachate. Currently, you're getting leachate from I would call it 2 different sources. Your open cells, and we don't know how much leachate is coming from your open cells, and your closed cells. All your ravines had a pipe drilled up the center, so they're draining leachate at some rate, but that's not measured. The only thing that's measured is the amount of leachate that's hauled to the POTW. So we've made assumptions as to how much leachate's coming from the open cells and how much leachate's coming from the closed cells. When you close the open cells, they will be closed with at this point, this might be something we look at in the future, but at this point, they'll be required to be closed with a plastic cap. So when you put a plastic cap on, within 3 to 6 years, leachate generation is going to go to almost nothing. So in the financial assurance cost estimate, a portion of your leachate generation's being taken down to almost nothing. And what's left is assumed to be largely what's from your currently closed areas or your unlined areas. If that estimate is way off, and there's actually more leachate coming from your current closed areas than what we assumed, then your cost estimate is quite a ways off, and you could find yourself significantly short. So we may be able to get some information through understanding pump cycles and looking at what's happening with the tanks, get a better estimate of where leachate's being generated from and how much by area. And we might be able to refine that estimate, then decide what to do. Because I've played around with those numbers, and if it's half and half, there's a lot more financial assurance needed. So that's another side
But, which will take years to do. I mean, once you said you lay that plastic on top, if it's gonna be some sort of a thick plastic, I'm assuming that's something, and it's gonna take years before you would really know that.
That part,
Yeah.
true. The unlined area, the closed areas now, they're gonna keep generating at the rate they're generating.
Yeah,
So we should be able to get an estimate relatively quickly of that.
once it's done. So my last question then for you, of the picture that you had up earlier, that you had lined over the whole landfill itself, if the landfill sits on about 150 acres, how much is that you had lined out? Is that like 80% of that?
They have lined out. Oh,
The picture that you had was almost at the very beginning, right there. Would you say that would be about 75% of that?
the pink line,
Yeah.
75% of your whole property.
Yeah, the 150.
I would say it's probably closer to half.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head what the acres of your landfill are.
It's 150.
The waste footprint or the,
No, the overall property, I think is
Okay.
what I believe.
I'd have to
Yeah.
look up what the actual landfill acreage.
Because I mean, I think every cell's a couple acres only, I think is what we use up, but I was just wondering, looking at that, what it looks like. It looks like a larger percentage of it, but
Yeah, those ravine fills are definitely bigger than 2 acres.
yeah. Okay, that's all I have.
Alan?
Tim, some of your well data, you had like, certain wells had cobalt, arsenic, barium, some had benzene, vinyl chloride. What accounts for those differences within the landfill? Why does one have so much of this and one has so much of that, type of a thing? I assume the contents are roughly the same, but maybe they're not. I don't know.
I think it's a decent assumption to say they're roughly the same. Part of it is the south side is the benzene. That's from gas migration, so that's probably more VOCs, the volatile organic compounds. Those would rather be in the air than in the water. So maybe a higher concentration of those are moving into that area because it's gas. The vinyl chloride on the south side or southwest side may be more a result of, that was kind of leachate directly going into the bedrock. So the VOCs that were in the leachate are directly injected into where we're monitoring. On the east side, that's leachate again, but it's migrating through a bunch of clay. One thing we did initially was we delineated the waste boundary on the east side, a portion of it. 2 of your wells were closer than 50 feet. They were like, I think, 10 to 15 feet away. Well, you weren't able to take advantage of your full attenuation zone with them that close. So we were allowed to move them out further. Those close ones, I believe, did have a benzene problem. But as you migrate further and get, again, natural attenuation happening, some of that stuff's going to degrade. The arsenic, the cobalt, even to some extent the barium, are probably not coming out of your landfill. Probably what's happening is you've got organics. There's going to be organics in the leachate that bacteria will eat. So what happens in the subsurface when, in a unimpacted subsurface, there isn't really much food for the bacteria, and they're just kind of sitting there, sleeping. You have a release of leachate or gas, and in this case leachate, that's got a bunch of food in it. So that goes out, and the bacteria start eating it. What they do first is use up the oxygen, then they start using up different electron acceptors until, just working down the scale. So aerobic, anaerobic, more and more anaerobic. Some of these metals, let's just take arsenic as an example, they have different redox states or valent states. So arsenic can be a +3, which is, I believe that's arsenate. It's not very soluble. It'll get reduced when the redox drops. Conditions are becoming more reducing. So lots of things in the subsurface will get reduced. It'll go to a minus, it'll change from arsenate to arsenite. Arsenite is more soluble. So the fact that organics went out and changed the conditions of the subsurface mobilized arsenic that was in the soil. That's still considered a impact of the landfill because the landfill mediated that dissolution or solubilization of the arsenic.
That implies the arsenic might have been there already and it just got released rather than sourced from
that's
the
what
landfill?
that I would say that's typically the case.
Okay.
The same would be true of cobalt and I believe barium as well. Barium is generally in the form of a barium sulfate. Sulfate is a fairly low redox electron acceptor. So if the bacteria have worked their way all the way down to using sulfate, and they start using sulfate, that's barium sulfate is barite. If they use that sulfate, the barium gets released. Now you got more barium in the water.
Kind of
And-
a catch-22, isn't it?
It is. And the thing is those kind of changes are going to be very long to ever reverse. And that's where, that's part of the reason for this concept of an attenuation zone point of compliance. I've even encountered some movement in the DNR to basically allow you, in cases of metals concentrations that aren't really changing, but they're above the levels, to move your point of compliance out. They're not calling it an attenuation zone point of compliance, but if you can find a point that's within 392 feet, so not further than that out, that's clean, you may, if this has legs and it keeps going, you might just move your point of compliance out to that point. And then you're not having to comply at the 50 foot. Because once you've changed the subsurface like that, it's not going to change back quickly.
Any other questions?
How far into the Winters property are we with wells?
We're pretty much right up to the pond.
Okay.
We can't go any further. We're pretty much bracketed. The other thing that I've already broached this with the DNR, but the pond is an impoundment, so the water in the pond should be higher than the surrounding groundwater, just by the fact that I've backed it up. So if I have groundwater migrating to the east toward the pond, and I have the pond that should be higher than the groundwater, those two are going to converge, and the flow path is going to turn to the south. So that's what we're looking at is then the migration pathway and how the plume is fully defined on the east side, and then where we would end up putting a attenuation zone point of compliance. Right now it looks like from the levels that the plume would actually come back onto your property. And then there's a ravine that continues down on back off. So we may have to look down that ravine further, and that may be the attenuation zone point of compliance further down that ravine.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Next on the agenda, we're going to hear from Jim. Some more SUDAS.
Mayor, council. SUDAS 3. We're all in our happy place now, aren't we? Yay. But something we need to chat about just very quickly. So there's a handout there, and the first page of it looks like this. Now the good news is the only thing that you guys really need to look at or be aware of is just the very first page of this. Everything else that's in that document is details about how you do this sort of stuff and how you do patches in the street. But it's important to know that we are getting to more standards. It is also important that I apologize to all of you at this point in time. Sincerely, I apologize to all of you because this is going to make some people, some contractors, upset. And if you haven't heard from them already, I can almost guarantee you that eventually you will. Not so much of what's in here, because what's in here is not a huge change from anything. In fact, there's hardly anything in there that's changed. What has changed is that we have a right-of-way inspector. We budgeted that in the last budgeting process as of May, I think it was, that we brought one on board, and we've been making some pretty good gains in tracking work in the right-of-way permits or sidewalk permits or driveway permits with community development, getting that information communicated back and forth and getting out there and looking at it. Something that we have never, ever, as far as I know, ever done. And so we are making more contractors aware that we're there and showing them these documents. We're now handing this out when permits are issued, et cetera, et cetera. But we are doing the best we can to make them aware. We've already had a couple contractors come in and visit with us about it, but it's a change for them that we're going to aggressively enforce this and inspect it. Where in the past, I just have to say it up front, we hardly did anything. You know, if you managed to see something and catch them at it, you would stop and chat with them about it, and that was always a negotiated solution, so to speak. That's gone by the wayside. One of the major complaints that I think you're going to hear is that people are going to say, well, this is going to cost more money, and of course that's going to cost the homeowner more money. Yes, and yes. But in the past, one of the biggest complaints we had is when contractors remove, especially concrete streets, they would do saw cuts. They wouldn't cut all the way down through the slab, and they would hammer that out. And if you can envision the thickness of the slab and a cut up here, when they would hammer this out, that concrete would fracture back underneath the slab that would stay. Those have caused us a lot of problems in the past, so Mr. Howell says, and we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So we are using existing joint lines as much as possible. If you're out there just digging a trench and you can get by with a 2 or 3 foot trench, you may be replacing up to something that might be 6 by 7 feet, a quarter of a slab of concrete between joints to do that, to minimize the amount of joints and the amount of problems that we have with patches. Part of the complaint that will come with that is that, well, how do you cleanly remove that concrete when you saw cut it? There's been some contractors that have complained about overcutting. If you can imagine the circular part of the blade, you know, if the corner is here and that circular blade comes cutting along here, you can't just cut to the corner because now you have this piece of concrete here that is left, and when you cut to here, you can't just cut to this corner because now you have this piece of concrete down here that's left, and when you go to break that out, you have the same problem. This piece tends to fracture back underneath the slab. So we've had a lot of miscommunication and a lot of, I don't know what to call them, tribal knowledge about, you know, the city won't let you overcut that, but if you've got this corner, you have to overcut to here to get full depth at the corner, and for here you have to overcut to get full depth there. We have no problem with overcutting, so don't let anybody tell you, well, we can't overcut it, so therefore we can't remove it. You can. It's not a problem. So unless you have any questions, I'm looking down at these notes. I think I am really done because this just has to do with standards for sidewalks, standards for driveways, and one other thing is that when you do work in the right-of-way, you can be subject to as many as 3 permits. One for sidewalk, one for driveway, and one for curb cut, or in essence, work in the right-of-way. We are working as desperately fast as we can to get rid of that system, bring to you guys code revisions to have it just be 1 permit. Because it's just better. Just forget all of the other things. It's just better. Less confusing, more common sense, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that, you'll see that in the future. Questions?
Santos.
So we hired a right-of-way inspector that we never had before, correct?
We hired a right-of-way inspector, yes.
Okay. So is that a part-time position or is that a full-time position?
That's a part-time position. Yeah, now, make no mistake, during the summer, you probably work quite a bit, and during the winter, probably you don't work quite a bit.
Okay.
So,
On the second page where you had the back where it says third point jointing, is that basically what we have for a full patch, what we're doing now with, I don't know, I think we just had higher construction do that? So basically, this is the rebar connections, the B joints, and then what we're having as far as the cuts go? This is basically a full roadway patch. Is that the way I'm seeing that?
I see the third point jointing portion of that standard, yes.
So this is basically what we gave, for example, what we just had that contract for the full depth patching. This is what they have.
Yes, in essence, yes.
Okay. So when they do a full depth patch for us, do they go out and have the right-of-way inspector come in and then view it as well too?
When the contractor that we've selected for the full depth patching, Pat Lynch, the assistant city engineer, is running that contract, but he's also the one that's helping with the right-of-way inspector too. So in essence, it's the same people looking at it, same requirements, yes.
And we're not requiring them to do permits, or we are?
There would be no reason for them to do a permit for that. I mean, we could if it was the
I just
council's.
want to know if we're consistent.
Primarily, the reason behind those permits is so we have accountability for the work that was done, so that if we get failures or anything else that go in the future, we can come back and at least acknowledge, who did that work, and try to make them accountable to any work that might have been done that wasn't the way it was supposed to. To me, that's the primary benefit of those permits. We know who's doing the patching. We're there watching them, and there's a 2-year maintenance bond that goes along with that patching work too. So I don't necessarily feel like we should do a permit, but
I
to
just
make
want to make
it
sure that we have some
fair,
sort of
we could.
control. And that's fine. I don't feel we need to. I was just wanting to make sure. But I do want to make sure that we do have some sort of control mechanism that, if you have a 2-year program on it, we identify what was done by the prior contractor, what was done by this contractor. So if we have one road,
Yes.
hypothetically, that has, 6 patches in it over a mile across, then who did the first 2? Who did the last 5?
Yes, we actually have computer data on every patch that was done, and we'll have computer data that's on every patch here. That through the GPS system we can pull it up and get accountability for who did it when, and
Maybe in next year's budget, I'd like to see that when we start going into the next year's full patch, because we talked about wanting to put more money into the streets. I think that would be ideal to be able to identify how much we've already done, how much we potentially would be putting into budget for next year as far as roads go.
Are you
That can
talking?
be done?
Are you talking about total dollars, total
No.
area?
Just full, like how many patches have we put in? Right.
Yeah,
for-
we can
for
get you
example-
that.
For example, if we've done, let's just say, for example, we have 25 miles of area that we've done patches in, and we've done, X amount of patches over this surface area, and this is how many we've done, and we've forecast.
How about
X
graphics? How about we just print out a roll that shows the streets we've worked on and where the patches
Yeah,
are?
something like that could be ideal. That
Okay,
way we can
perfect.
At least, we can also share that with
We can
others,
do
so-
that.
Okay. That's all I have, yeah.
Alan?
Jim, if you look at that front sheet and the 2 left diagrams where the flare, type A flare, and then there's a type A with the radii. Are those, I can see a lot of private driveways, maybe the type A with the flare. And a lot of commercial driveways are with the radii.
Yes.
As you know, and probably everybody that drives, so often it doesn't seem like there's enough of a flare, because invariably somebody runs off the flare and there's big potholes off the concrete.
Yes.
How do we address that? I mean, I suppose it's one of those things, the more flare you put on, they just keep moving themselves off the concrete.
Yeah, and to me, the big difference, residential, I don't think it's that big a deal. Commercial, it's a big deal.
Yes.
And so it's trucks. And I don't know that we would ever deny anybody a permit to widen out a driveway or to make those flares even farther out if they were having that problem with their driveway.
Yeah, I didn't know if there was specifications of how wide the driveway has to be compared to how big the flares have to be.
We only have just two standard guidelines. Residential is 24 foot wide, and commercial is 36 foot wide. So you make them wider, but all of that depends on what the configuration of the parking lot is and where the loading dock is and everything behind that driveway. The best example I can give you is the loading dock that's for the downtown Hy-Vee, right there along 5th Street. That's an incredibly cumbersome place for them to get into and get back out of. And I don't think those driveways are anywhere near enough. And on the edges of those, they've actually got boulders they've put up there to try to encourage them to stay on the pavement. But yeah, I mean, that happens everywhere. And if people wanted to widen their driveway out in the right-of-way because of problems like that, they could.
Okay. I just thought of this as you were answering that, the intersection at Washington and Park Avenue, on the corner that's going east out of town, where there used to be a used car lot there across from
I'm with you.
T's. Best thing that the city ever done, I guess, is they really widened that sweep out. And because semis were always jumping the curb there, and I don't recall ever seeing a semi jump a curb since. So somebody had the good idea of making those
Yep.
flares useful.
Yeah.
Well, then the other thing I was wondering, if contractors say have to dig into a street like for doing sewer work or something, and they fill in the patch, but that street is concrete with a overlay on it?
Yes.
Do they concrete up to the surface of the overlay, or do they stay below that?
Concrete to the surface of the overlay, and then should we ever overlay it again, we'll mill that off and then put asphalt over the
Because
top
I
of
would
it.
say, how do you deal with that maintenance-wise? Because you got the concrete mixed with overlay,
Yeah, to minimize costs for not only the homeowner, but obviously for the contractor too. I mean, can you imagine how much that tiny little bit of asphalt would cost you to come out and have them put that in and everything else? So we just do concrete to the surface. If we ever overlay that street again, it would mill off. That concrete would mill off just like the asphalt mills off, and then you could overlay the whole thing again, and you'd be back to where you were.
Although I've traveled a lot of streets that have been milled off, and there's a block of concrete, and a block of concrete, and a block of concrete, so,
Those are mostly for manholes, though.
right. And I see, you occasionally will adjust the manholes, but you probably try to avoid doing that if you have.
Any other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Comments? Councilman Harvey, anything tonight?
Nothing tonight, Your Honor.
Councilman Spread?
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Councilman Fitzgerald?
Nothing at this time, Your Honor.
Councilman Malcolm?
Nothing to unite, Your Honor. Thank you.
Councilwoman Brockert?
Riverbend neighbors are going to meet Monday evening at 7 p.m. at Fire Station Number 2, and we will have as a guest speaker Jim Edgmond, who's our city engineer, and he will be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Ooh, there you go.
Or he knows where to get the answers.
There you go.
He'll tell you where to go.
Councilman Saucedo?
Nothing tonight, Your Honor.
Councilman Brackett?
Just a reminder that the county fair is next week, and the parade's on Sunday at 2 in West Liberty.
Staff?
Nothing tonight, Your Honor.
I just had a few things. We have lots of stuff going on this weekend, several different events at the Art Center for families, so you'll want to scope those out. Rockin' on Sycamore is Friday and Saturday night, and second Saturday, of course, is Saturday, and the summer concert series is Sunday. Our city guests next week are Melanie Alexander, the director of the Art Center, going to update us on the programs that they have coming up. And then Chad Yoakum is going to do a presentation on our city, on the homeowners class that he does. I think it's a great program that our housing department does to try to help folks learn everything you need to know about being a homeowner. And then, let's see, our next Coffee with the Mayor is July 20th at Wildcat Den, and after that, we'll be doing some filming for our city. Hearing nothing else, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Or adjourned?